Good morning, and we're going to start our class here shortly. I'm going to pull up the slide deck as always, and we are now in Malek Aleph 10, chapter 10, and very exciting to hear more of the adventures of Solomon, Shlomo, and here we go. Let's have a great class. Once again, just as a reference, we have a very powerful United Kingdom at the right locations between the Euphrates and the very weakened Kingdom of Egypt, weakened to the point where Solomon can take one of Pharaoh's daughters as his bride and seal up a very powerful alliance with the Kingdom of Egypt. And so it's a very incredibly wealthy, lots of materials coming into that area, and Solomon in control of the seaports along the Levant and taking full advantage of being at the right place at the right time. And let's talk a little bit about, I'll reference this continually, that we have now in Jerusalem, the Zion, the city of David. We have the Temple Mount. Again, good architectural renderings, as much as anybody can really have a vision for what the first Solomonic temple looked like. But it was magnificent by all accounts, literally one of the great wonders of the world at that time. And as we've studied in the previous classes, many people came from all over just to see the great palace and the great temple of Solomon. In addition to his tremendous wisdom, as we read some of that last week. A current photograph, one of my favorites, of the western wall of the Temple Mount at Jerusalem, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque over what many people believe is the actual site of the temple, both the first temple and the recreated second temple at the time that the exiles came back with Ezra and Nehemiah, and then the great building program that Herod the Great would put forward. And we move on. Again, we've covered this, but just a good reminder, we have a vague idea of where Solomon's his palace was, a magnificent structure. They called it the Forest of Lebanon because so many cedar posts were used. It must have had a tremendous, wonderful aroma. And then the Temple Mount, very close to his palace, and a very strong defensive wall. And this wall has been discovered archaeologically. And we have the wonderful works of many archaeologists that Dr. Metzar, especially spending most of her career doggedly determined to find that 10th century BCE wall, and she found it. And so she found the strong retaining wall next to the Temple Mount, and I've showed in past classes some of the photographs. That is confirmed not only by the way the stone was hewn, but also pottery shards, other material evidence that confirms it's truly 10th century BCE, the time of Solomon and his kingdom. We're going to shift gears, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about a visitor that Solomon receives, the Queen of Sheba or Sabah. I think we can be on very, very good archaeological and historical grounds by calling her the Queen of Sabah. We know a great deal of good archaeology that's come out of Yemen and Ethiopia in the last 20 years especially. And this is again an artist's rendering of Solomon's palace, the throne that he ruled on. He had, as described, 12 golden lions as you walked up to him, and she is coming with a large retinue bearing many gifts and acknowledging his great wisdom. And we'll read about that in the text. But I want to take time at the first part of the class to get into some of the really good archaeology that is coming forward. We know without a doubt that there was a series of kingdoms. One of the most famous was the kingdom of Aksum, perhaps a little bit earlier, maybe not called Aksum, was the kingdom of Saba, but it is a series of historical kingdoms which southern, what we call southwest Yemen, right across from the Red Sea, in the area of Eritrea and Ethiopia. These were, for many centuries, one kingdom. Different names at different times. The most successful, Aksum, headquartered at, still to this day, the city of Aksum in Ethiopia, but certainly controlling or in league with or having some sort of hegemony over Sabah. And many people believe at times the Yemenites were controlling the area. At other times, what we would say today, the Ethiopian peoples were controlling both sides of the Red Sea. But this area has had a series of very, very powerful and wealthy kingdoms. And of course, the basis of it is the amazing aromatic frankincense, myrrh, and the other aloes that come from the plants, particularly the trees in that area. And it is going to be used, that incense is going to be used literally all over the world, from India to China, to the Greeks and Romans and Persians. Everybody wants frankincense. And of course, coming up through Solomon's kingdom to go out the great trading ports along the Levant that he controls now, is going to make Israel a very wealthy kingdom indeed. But this is a real kingdom, historically and archaeologically. I'm going to share some of the archaeology. Hopefully this is encouraging. The Sabah civilization, we know, began as early as the 10th to 12th century BCE. So that would be the time, certainly could be ahead of David, even of Saul, the time of the what we have called the Judges, certainly during the time of Solomon. Between 980 and 920 BCE, this is the time of the reign of Solomon. Kings and queens of Sabah created a tremendous outburst of building and activity around the Yemenite, no longer a modern city, but the Yemenite area of Marib. And we'll see some of the pictures of that. Many great temples and monuments date back to this period. Sabah was rich in spices and agricultural products, and carried on a wealth of trade by overland, caravan, and by sea. So they would have the camel routes going up from the Arabian Peninsula through Mecca, through Medina, on into the Levant, where Jerusalem is. And then out from the great ports of Tyre, Sidon, Ascalon, Jaffa, all of these along the coast that Solomon now controls. For centuries, it controlled Ba'ab Manib, the straits leading between the Red Sea and it established cities in Ethiopia. And so we know linguistically, we know archaeologically and historically that these people from the Ethiopian African side to the Yemenite Arabian Peninsula side, back and forth function linguistically, genetically, culturally as one people. And there is a profound connection that begins with, I think, trading, and then on to cultural exchange, and then on to, I think, direct contact of the Jewish people with the peoples of Yemen and on to Ethiopia. Next slide. The Aksumite Empire was an ancient Ethiopian kingdom that spanned what is now Eritrea, Ethiopia, Eastern Sudan, and Yemen at its peak, and we just talked about that. It was centralized in northern Ethiopia with its capital at the city of Aksum. The rulers styled themselves as the King of Kings, kings of over Aksum, Himra, Saba, Salhin, Hamasien, Sarawi, Atsiyamo, Abeya, Barya, and Kush. And so that is an extensive kingdom, very powerful, very wealthy. And as our narrative tells us, one of its queens, we don't know, not listed by name, but one of the queens coming from this fabulous culture comes to visit Sholomon. And here is some of the writing. This is a stone at the Yemenite site, and you can see that the language, that written script is very similar to what is called ancient Ethiopian. And then if you go on the Yemenite site, you have this fabulous, what they call temple to the sun. And it is very elaborate, very striking. There's nothing quite like it in the ancient world. And it presents itself as a very sophisticated high culture. If you go now back to the, whoops, sorry. If you go now back to the Ethiopian side, we have, again, bas reliefs at different locations, and you see the same type of written script, very unique. And it will become, this is very ancient Ethiopian, it'll become the standard script of Ethiopia. And so next slide here. And here is again some bas relief of some of that similar script. This is back in Yemen, and so we can see back and forth that there was a deep and abiding connection between the two great cultures. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about it. It'll come about in the narrative that it tells us that Solomon would go on these great shipping expeditions. He would tie up with his partner Hiram from Tyre, and they would literally be able to send ships all the way down to Ophir. That is this area of Ethiopia and Sheba or Saba, and then all the way to Tarshish. That is in south central Spain, literally on the other side of the Rock of Gibraltar in the Atlantic. So that's just fascinating how far the reach was of Solomon's great trading empire. And then we look and we know from looking at Phoenician vessels that have sunk, and we have found them the 13th century, the 11th century, the 9th century, the 10th century, the time of Solomon. And we know what those galleys looked like, and they were built to be able to haul a tremendous amount of supplies. They had a straight wind rigger, a square rigger, to take advantage of the wind, and if not, they could oar by manual power and take their ship anywhere they wanted to go. Very effective sea people. And all the way on the other side of the world in southern Spain, we have found the great ancient ruins of Tartessa or Tarshish in your Bible. Literally, Jonah says, I won't go to Nineveh. And he gets on a ship headed for Tarshish, and very much could have been one of these great Phoenician ships heading on to Spain. And so that's as far away as you can possibly get. And so just an overview of how effective the narratives, how realistic and accurate the narratives are on what we know archaeologically. Here in our narrative, we'll read of one of the queens of Saba, and here we see an entire kingdom of Saba affiliated, connected with part of the great Ethiopian ancient kingdom of Aksum also. And with that, we're going to switch out the sharing to the narrative. And I'm going to stop there and let you guys have a discussion just to maybe talk about what do you think about how God connects people. Now I'm gonna kind of wrap up the narrative with a proposition that I think is very, very accurate, because we read about this in the Old Testament, and we're going to read a section in the New Testament, the book of Acts, and it's very easy to be able to connect the dots. But think about how God is working through the nations. So here's Solomon. They're in one location, but they're trading already all the way to Western Mediterranean, where Europe is. They're trading all the way down to Saudi Arabia, the tip of Yemen. Many people believe right on over to India. And so even at the time of Solomon, there's this tremendous churn of cultural contact and trade. And so how is God setting up the nations in connection for his will? And we'll take a pause there. Okay, it's good to be back. Let's look at our narrative. We'll jump into it. And please reflect on some of the slides. Hopefully that gives you some visuals. 1 Kings now, chapter 10. When the queen of Saba heard what was being said about Solomon or Shlomo, because of the name of Adonai, she came to test him with difficult questions. She arrived in Yerushalayim accompanied by a very great retinue, including camels bearing spices and gold in great abundance and precious stones. When she appeared before Solomon, she spoke with him about everything on her heart. And Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. After the queen of Saba had seen all of Solomon's wisdom, the palace he had built, the food at his table, the manner of seating of his officials, the manner in which his staff served him, how they were dressed, his personal servants, and his burnt offerings, which he offered in the house of Adonai, it left her breathless. My goodness, that's quite a statement of a witness coming into the palace and the court of Solomon. And she's not coming from just any location. She is coming from also a sophisticated kingdom, but she is left breathless. She said to the king, "What I heard in my own country about your deeds and your wisdom is true, but I couldn't believe the report until I came and saw for myself. Actually, they did not tell me even the half of it. Your wisdom and prosperity surpasses the reports I heard. How happy your people must be. How happy these servants of yours who are always here attending you and get to hear your wisdom. Blessed be Adonai, your God, who took pleasure in you to put you on the throne of Israel. Because of Adonai's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to administer judgment and justice fairly." Now that is quite a statement. And she is giving a huge compliment to Solomon. And she is couching it in a very interesting way. She is acknowledging that it is the God of Israel that has done this. You, sir, have received this benefit. You, sir, have this gift. Your people are blessed because of this, but it has come from Adonai, your God. Let's stop and have some good discussion on always getting our priorities right. Who gives us the blessing? Where do blessings come from? In the end, who is really in charge of everything? Of course, that's God. Let's have some discussions, because I think we can start to think, I did this, I created this, and of anybody, Solomon could have. And yet, he has these reminders along the way that no, you didn't. It came from God, even in a compliment. So let's take a pause and have some good discussion. Okay, we're back. We'll pick up the narrative. Then she, that's the queen of Saba, gave the king 4 tons of gold. I'm just guesstimating that's about 165 million in US dollars right now. That's a lot of wealth. A huge number of spices and precious stones. Never again did there arrive such an abundance of spices as those that the queen of Saba gave to Solomon. And I'm sure it was camel caravan after camel caravan of frankincense and myrrh and camphor and all of these wonderful unguents and spices and incense, precious as can be to the ancient people. You can't imagine how precious they were at that time. And so we get this amazing vision of this fabulous wealth coming into to Solomon, and she just gives it to him. And part of this is she's establishing a relationship with Israel. She's establishing, I'm sure, trade concessions with Solomon. They will become trading partners, and I believe more than that. I think there are many unnamed women that become part of his many wives, and she may very well have been one of them. Because certainly we now, and I'll wrap up with this, we know culturally, we know archaeologically, and now we know genetically that the Jewish people, an entire wing, if you will, of Jews, of Jewish people, would migrate or come to or be brought up in what is Ethiopia. The Falasha Jews were air transported into Israel to become citizens only about 30 years ago. And that's a magnificent story. But let's get back to the narrative. Hiram's fleet, which had brought gold from Ophir, now brought in from Ophir large quantities of sandalwood and precious stones. Well, folks, sandalwood only comes from one place, and that is India and Ceylon, Sri Lanka today. And so he's trading far beyond just Ethiopia and Saudi Arabia. These ships are going all the way over to into the Indian Ocean, into the subcontinent of India, and bringing sandalwood and other precious stones, I'm sure rubies and emeralds. The king used the sandalwood to make columns for the house of Adonai and for the royal palace, and also lyres and lutes for his singers. No sandalwood like it has come or been seen to this day. And that's probably, I think that's a very accurate statement, because it took this kind of wealth and this kind of planning to go all the way to India to bring in these precious woods all the way back to place in his palace, in the temple, and to make very, very beautiful musical instruments, I'm sure, played at the temple and in his palace. King Solomon gave the queen of Sheba, everything she wanted, whatever she asked, in addition to the presents he gave her on his own initiative. I don't know, she might say, hey, I really like that, and say, okay, load it up. After this, she returned and went back to her country, she and her servants. The weight of gold Solomon received annually came to 22 tons. 22 tons. That's a lot of gold, besides which came from sales tax, custom duties, and assessments collected by all the kings of the mixed peoples and by their district governors. That tells you right here, he is a king over kings. King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold. 15 pounds of gold went into one shield. He made 300 more shields of hammered gold, 3 3/4 pounds going into one shield. The king put these in the house of the Lavan forest. The king also made a large throne of ivory, and overlaid it with the finest gold. The throne had 6 steps, a back with a rounded top, arms on each side of the seat, 2 lions standing beside the arms, and 12 more lions standing on each side of the 6 steps. And that picture I showed earlier of someone coming up, so here would be these gold lions that you would walk between to get up to Solomon. Nothing like it had ever been made in any kingdom. All King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold. All the utensils in the house of the Lavan forest were of pure gold. None was silver, for in Solomon's time it was regarded as having little value. Wow. The king made a fleet of large Tarshish ships. There we go. They would go all the way to Tarshish and back, along with Hiram's fleet. Once every 3 years, the Tarshish fleet came in bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Again, you get peacocks from India, and you get apes from down through Ethiopia. And so you can start to see his trade route. So King Solomon surpassed all the kings on earth in both wealth and wisdom. All the earth sought to have an audience with Solomon in order to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. Each one brought his present, articles of silver, articles of gold, clothing, armor, spices, horses, mules. And this continued for year after year. And he had a very long reign. Solomon amassed chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen. He assigned them to the chariot cities and to the king in Jerusalem. The king made silver in Jerusalem as common as stones, and he made cedars as abundant as sycamore fig trees that are in the Shephelah. Solomon's horses had been brought from Egypt and from Keva, with the king's agents having bought them from the dealers in Keva at the going price. A chariot from Egypt cost 15 pounds of silver shekels, and a horse 3 3/4 pounds of shekels. All the kings of the Hittim and the kings of Aram purchased them at these prices through Solomon's agents. And so you can see how he's working his network. He buys the horses down in Egypt. He prepares them. He gets them onto a chariot. He sells them up north to the Arameans, and he's making money coming and going. Quite an entrepreneur. And so let's just stop there. And why do you think in our scriptures so much narrative is given to describing the amount and the magnitude of wealth and fame that God pours upon Solomon? Let's take a break here. And we're back. I wanted to kind of tuck point the class today to go to Acts chapter 8 and kind of see a little bit of the rest of the story that I think it's a marvelous testament to the continuity of our scriptures and all the historical knowledge that we are gaining from the time of Solomon and David. And then here we see the effect literally 800 years later. And here we go. So what's happening? Well, an angel of Adonai, same God, said to Philip, now it's the New Testament period. Now it's one of the great disciples of Yeshua. Get up, go southward on the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Azah, the desert road. That means going on down through the Sinai. We'll go on down through Egypt all the way. So he got up and went. On his way, he caught sight of an Ethiopian, a eunuch who was minister in charge of all the treasure of the Kandake queen of Kandake, or queen of Ethiopia. He had been to Jerusalem to worship. So he's Jewish, and yet he lives in Ethiopia. And he is a great servant of the great queen at that time of Ethiopia, Kandake. And now, as he was returning home, he was sitting in his chariot reading the prophet Yeshayahu, that's Isaiah. The Spirit said to Philip, go over to this chariot, stay close to it. As Philip ran up, he heard the Ethiopian reading from Yeshayahu, the prophet. Do you understand what you're reading? He asked. How can I, he said, unless someone explains it to me. And he invited Philip to climb up and sit with him. Now, the portion of the Tanakh, or the Jewish Bible, that he was reading was this. In Isaiah, or Yeshayahu, he was like a sheep led to the slaughter, like a lamb silent before the shears. He did not open his mouth. He was humiliated and denied justice. Who will tell about his descendants since his life had been taken from the earth? Of course, that's the great passage in Isaiah describing Yeshua. The eunuch said to Philip, here's my question to you. Is the prophet talking about himself or someone else? Then Philip started to speak, and beginning with that passage, he went on to tell him the good news about Yeshua. As they were going down the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, look, here's some water. Is there any reason why I shouldn't be immersed? He ordered the chariot stopped. Then both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and Philip immersed him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away. The eunuch saw him no more because he continued on his way full of joy. But Philip showed up at Ashdod and continued proclaiming the good news as he went through all the towns until he came to Caesarea. And so here we are, closing out this lesson 800 something years later, 900 something years later, no more than that, 950 perhaps years later. And here is a descendant of the great, great Ethiopian people who had been affected centuries before with their trade contacts, the going up north of their great queen of Saba, visiting with Sholoman. Obviously, connections were made, and we see the results. After all those centuries, Jewish people worshiping Adonai in Ethiopia, coming up for the high holy days, and this righteous Jewish man from Ethiopia gets to hear the gospel. And so what a closing of the highest point of Solomon's reign and the real high point. This is the watershed high point of the United Kingdom. It will go down, unfortunately, from here. So let's close out with some thoughts and prayers about what does it mean to if you find yourself having wealth or a position of influence. Are you using it for God? This Ethiopian eunuch, we know, had an effect, because there is to this day, and has been since this time, an incredible Ethiopian Christian community, and it's testament to how God's will works. So think on these things. Thank you for the class. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll continue in this great journey through God's word. Thank you very much. God bless.